Welcome back to my second lecture on pre versus post-Darwinian ways of thinking. In my first lecture, I tried to present to you how a pre-Darwinian perspective on nature assumes that there is order, reason, and this would be divine reason in the events of nature, assumes that this proves the existence of an orderer or a designer, i.e. the existence of God, and thirdly, assumes that nature to some extent reveals the purpose of God for his creation, including the ethical behavior of human beings. And I gave you the example of patriarchy and the example of sex is for procreation, and sex must be heterosexual. Therefore, homosexuality is wrong. Now, what I want to suggest and present in this video lecture is how Darwin challenges this perspective and why it is in the initial stages of reaction to Darwin, it is concern over this part of Darwinianism that really does control the dialogue rather than what's going to happen later, in the Scopes trial, a preoccupation with what this means about the origin of human beings. Where, as I've mentioned, Darwin doesn't even get into that in his book, The Origin of Species. So how does Darwin challenge the perspective of the pre-Darwinian world? First of all, if you read Darwin, The Origin of Species, he presents nature as disorderly and as chaotic, with no built-in purpose or design. All right, so that there are changes in nature, there are mutations in nature. Some of those mutations are good, some of those are not good for the preservation of that species. So some animals can adapt, and those adaptations enable them to survive. Other animals are unable to adapt, and that failure to adapt means that they are not able to survive. Great example, dinosaurs could not adapt, therefore dinosaurs do not exist. But there's no reason for that other than their own failure to be able to adapt to the disorderly, chaotic changes in nature. Secondly, he presents nature as a place where there are both winners and losers. So not everything that happens in nature is to the best end. In fact, we can't even use those kinds of terms when we talk about nature because nature is. Nature is amoral. Things survive, species die out. It's all on the basis of their responses to the environment. It's on the basis of their ability to adapt to their environment. And there are winners and there are losers. Some mutations are good, some mutations are bad in terms of their impact on the survivability of the species. Thirdly, he presents nature as a place where random changes in the environment influence the development and evolution of species. So it is the random nature of change. It is the environmental changes. It is all of these kinds of random changes in the environment which then deeply influence the survival of individual species and also influence the evolution of adaptations and mutations by, we know now, favoring certain genetic predispositions, by favoring certain genetic changes which allow the one species to survive, which is all wrapped up in Darwin's notion of natural and sexual selection. And perhaps most importantly, the implications of everything that Darwin writes about is that nature is a place of cruelty and violence. Nature is not this harmonious sort of working machine like a watch in which everything works together to, the advancement of nature as a whole, but rather nature is a dog-eat-dog world. Nature is a place of cruelty and violence in which the strongest survive and the weak do not. All right, so that is his basic presentation. All right, now, a great example of this is what's known as Darwin's Wasp. And when you read the story of Darwin, it is his finding this wasp, which played a pivotal role in his own development as a thinker. Darwin, of course, was not an atheist. Darwin had trained to be a minister, but then he went on this sort of voyage, which you all know about, the Beagle, observing nature. He was a naturalist, so he observed things, right? And when he was in South Africa, he observed this particular phenomenon, which is now called Darwin's wasp. It is a wasp which lays its eggs inside a caterpillar, so that the larva of that wasp can feed on the caterpillar. The wasp, in order to do this, paralyzes the caterpillar, but leaves the caterpillar alive but unable to move, so that the eggs that it lays as they grow can basically survive by eating the caterpillar from the inside out. As this note says, the victim, that is in this case the caterpillar, is devoured alive from the inside out. Now, if you take a pre-Darwinian or the view of Aquinas, this then you would have to argue that this wasp eating this caterpillar was designed by God, reflects God's design for the world, and in some respects is an indication of divine order. To Darwin, if you take seriously the idea that God created a wasp and gave the wasp the instinct and ability to lay its young inside a caterpillar and to paralyze the caterpillar so that the caterpillar remained alive even as it was being eaten from the inside out. All right, so that it's feeling whatever pain a caterpillar can feel, but is unable to do anything about the larva, the eggs, the baby wasps, if you will, that are eating it, and it dies only at the very end as the wasps leave. Darwin's conclusion to this is very interesting. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created this wasp with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars. Now, what he's saying, and when you read Darwin carefully, these kinds of things which happen in nature, and this is by no means unique to nature, but it is a great example of what Darwin observed that caused an existential crisis in his own belief structure. He looked at this and he said, how could a God who is supposedly all-loving and all-powerful purposely create a situation in nature where caterpillars are devoured in great pain with no ability to escape? What kind of God would do this? And you are left, if you take this seriously, if nature reflects divine order, then you are left with a God who is sadistic, a God who delights in the pain of creatures. And Darwin could never adopt that idea of God. What's really interesting is people see Darwin as hating God. And in fact, Darwin is motivated by a desire to deliver God. I mean, in some respects, you can see Darwinism as theodicy. It is an attempt to deliver God from the accusation that he is a sadistic being who delights in torturing his creatures. Now, for Darwin, the only way he could reconcile belief in a good God with the existence of this wasp was ultimately to remove God from the natural world, and to argue that the natural world does not reflect divine purpose, the natural world does not reflect divine order, but the natural world operates according to the logic, or to sort of the illogic, if you will, of itself, of natural selection and sexual selection in response to environmental change. All right, and that's really important, because we'll never understand Darwin unless we see this wasp and understand how the presence of this wasp was life-altering for Darwin, because he could no longer, in good conscience, reconcile the notion of a loving God who is in control of nature, who is working everything in nature for the best benefit of nature itself, with the existence of a wasp who so utterly causes pain to another living creature. And so in an effort really to deliver God from the accusation that he is a sadistic, evil, pain-loving being, Darwin then removes God from the natural world, and then looking at the natural world seeks to uncover the natural reasons for change, which then leads him ultimately to what becomes known as Darwinianism, or what becomes known as evolution. So when we get to the end, if we've looked at these pre-Darwinian views, nature is ordered, reveals purpose and meaning. For Darwin, there's no purpose or order to nature, just adaptation and survival. Whereas Aquinas argued the order of nature indicates the existence of an orderer. For Darwin, since there's no observable order or meaning to nature, what is, what happens, happens, the watchmaker argument for the existence of God makes no sense. And thirdly, the fact that nature reflects God's design means that we can look to nature to understand God's will for human beings and thus develop an ethics based on natural law. Darwin argues instead, or at least the implication of his observations is, since there is no design in nature, we cannot use nature to determine what is moral or immoral. What you see in nature is simply what is. You see adaptation, you see natural selection, you see sexual selection, you see the impact of environmental change, and you see creatures trying to survive. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. Some adaptations are good, some adaptations are bad vis-a-vis species survival. Some species cannot adapt, okay? But there's no order to that. There's nobody upstairs going, okay, I want the dinosaurs to die now. It just happens. Because nature operates according to its own, if you will, logic, its own way of doing things. And because of that, then you can't argue because no dog puts on a condom, therefore no human being should put on a condom. Because a dog or a male animal wants to have sex in order to procreate, therefore every human being should have as the goal of sex procreation, and an attempt to have sex without procreation is somehow unnatural. Now here's the key. Before Darwin, when you called something unnatural, you ipso facto were calling it immoral. If you could say homosexuality is unnatural, that meant homosexuality was immoral. After Darwin, those are no longer linked. Because you can't argue just because it's unnatural, it is immoral. Because, and perhaps this is the largest difference, the pre-Darwinian understanding of nature assumes that there is some sort of stability to nature. There is some sort of continuity to nature. Whereas the Darwinian world, nature is always changing, adapting. So what was true 2 million years ago is not true today, will not be true 2 million years from now. We can't even assume on the basis of Darwinian thought that human beings are the final epoch or stage in evolution. For all we know, given how small our time on the evolutionary time schedule is, we may be a transitional species. And there may be a species that is better adapted to its environment that comes after us, that ultimately sees us as being, a step on the evolutionary chain. Now, not everything that happens in nature goes forward. Sometimes it goes backwards. There's no good or bad. It's amoral. So therefore, you can't use it in any way, shape, or form to try to establish some kind of morality. I hope this gives you an insight into the true significance of Darwin and the way in which he has changed the perspective that modern people have on nature. Thank you.